Hello everyone and welcome! I've got my custom 124 scale RC39 Chevy coupe back on the bench. I think this car still remains as one of my favorite smaller scale builds that I've ever done. What started out as a static model kit for Monogram was methodically transformed into a fully functional radio-controlled vehicle, with lots of detail both on the top and bottom. For this project, I didn't want to just slap this body onto a pre-existing RC platform, but instead work with the frame piece that was included in the model kit, swapping out the non-functional drivetrain and suspension pieces included with some of my own custom designed and 3D printed components. This resulted in a super lifelike plastic model that can actually be driven around, blending both the artistry of model building and the engineering of custom building a radio-controlled vehicle. Is there some compromise? Absolutely. For example, while this model might feature a big block Chevy V8 under the hood, as you can see, the performance of this vehicle is not exactly setting the pavement on fire. To make the functional electronics I chose for this project as out of the way and hidden as possible, I chose some of the smallest size components that would be usable. These components ended up working out great and were very easy to hide in the fuel tank located on the frame, pretty much in no way visible on the finished model. However, with only one S-LiPo compatibility and an N20 size motor, the speeds here aren't exactly record-setting. As I've said before with many of these projects, from the very beginning, you sort of want to establish what your goals and priorities are for any given project, and understand that emphasizing certain elements, such as a lifelike appearance, might have to result in some sacrifices in other aspects, such as performance, and unfortunately sometimes even ease of maintenance. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do an RC conversion, but I do think it's important to establish your priorities at the start and plan the project accordingly. Also, you'll find that some plastic model kits are better for an RC conversion than others, especially if you want to try and obtain a high level of detail. As you might recall when I was building this 39 Chevy coupe, a process which I documented in a number of videos here on the channel, so many things were just going right. These functional RC components were fitting right into place of the non-functional parts included in the kit. The included wheels and tires were pretty easy to modify to make work, and there's plenty of space in the trunk for the batteries, both to power the RC electronics and the functional lights. Even the way that the body can be separated into two pieces is great, as it makes accessing the battery extremely easy and convenient. That's not to say that there weren't a few challenges here and there, but overall an extremely successful conversion, and a phenomenal model kit for this type of project, even if some finer details could be a little lacking in certain areas, which I did address in the interior with these custom door panels. Of course, huge thanks to everyone who saw that prior build series and kept me motivated throughout the entire process. If you'd like to see the complete build of this 39 Chevy coupe, I will be including a link to that video playlist below in the description with much more detail on every step of this build. But even with this car's lack of performance, maybe not making it the most fun RC car that I own to drive, I still like to get it out every once in a while, though naturally, like with anything else, especially this delicate and detailed, maintenance will be required from time to time. And that time for this 39 Chevy coupe is now. Really though, this car has actually been very reliable and has had almost no issues, but I do still have a few things that I want to address today. The first thing on the agenda was to take care of this front wheel, which as you can see is a little loose. As I recall, the axles were threaded into each wheel with a bit of glue being used to help keep everything secured. While the wheel is still attached, with it not coming off while being gently pulled, clearly there's way too much play here, so I'll need to take some things apart and reattach the wheel. All things considered, this 39 Chevy coupe isn't actually that hard to work on. When I'm building these custom RC vehicles, I do my best to make things as easy to disassemble and work on as possible, but sometimes compromises have to be made in order to maintain a more lifelike appearance. Again, it's all a balance, but I just have the frame being held to the body here with a couple of screws, which once removed, everything can easily be separated. I was able to remove the wheel with a bit of force, but I'll want to remove the knuckles as well in order to properly reattach the wheel to the axle. I did end up needing to trim just a little bit off of a spot on the frame to have enough room for the screwdriver. I think maybe it was a mounting point for a shock absorber or something like that, which would have been included in the plastic model kit, but that aside, it all came apart as easily as you could hope for with a car in this scale and with this level of detail. From here, I have pretty good access to the tiny screws holding on the upper and lower control arms, so I can remove them and get access to this assembly. This is our FC01 front suspension and steering design, which is obviously a great choice for projects like these when you want suspension components that look proportional to the rest of the model. While this car would not have had a double control arm front suspension from the factory, on a custom street rod style build like this, a double control arm front suspension swap, such as incorporating a Mustang 2 style front end, would be a relatively popular upgrade. In that same way, this FC01 was quite easy to adapt to fit on this model kit's frame piece. Just a great design for these types of projects, and working on this 39 Chevy Coupe has definitely got me wanting to do another street rod or hot rod style project in the future. But after adding some more glue and threading that wheel back on, though not too tight to make sure that it can rotate freely, that area of the car was fixed. I moved on to the next thing, which was adding some coil springs to the rear suspension. As you can see, this car uses leaf springs in the rear, which were 3D printed using PLA. In the beginning, they were very flexible and worked great, while still supporting the weight of the vehicle. As is generally the case with 3D printed leaf springs though, over time they've sagged to the point where they're no longer supporting the rear, and the suspension is bottomed out. It can be quite hard to find the balance of utilizing springs that are soft enough to where the suspension actually moves, considering the car only weighs a few ounces, but at the same time having the material be durable enough to where it'll hold its shape and not slowly sag over time. 3D printed leaf springs work great, as they can be precisely adjusted to deliver the desired support and suspension flex. But unless stored with the wheels off the ground, over time sagging is pretty much inevitable. While maybe not the most ideal solution in certain circumstances, one of the easiest ways to resolve this is what I chose to do with this 39 Chevy Coupe, and that's to simply add in some metal coil springs to sit between the axle and the frame, which will assist those leaf springs. It's very simple just to glue them right into place, and I don't think it really detracts that much from the overall look of the vehicle. They're pretty well tucked out of the way. These springs supply just enough force to where they keep the rear suspension supported, while not applying too much to where the suspension wouldn't be able to move while driving. Basically, I want the suspension to remain relatively soft. Since installing these springs, the rear suspension was now sitting much higher up, as like I said before, the rear end was pretty much fully bottomed out earlier. At first I wasn't really sure if I liked this stance as much with that little bit of forward rake, and I even added some weight in the rear to push the suspension down, but honestly I think this look is growing on me. If I wanted to have the rear of the car sitting lower while still having some suspension movement, I would have to make some further modifications to either the frame or the axle assembly so that the coil springs have more room before they become fully compressed. Really though, I'm satisfied with how it is currently, and it's not like I need off-road crawler levels of suspension flex here. Initially, I thought that was all the work I was going to be doing on this vehicle, but it can never be that easy. I ran into a bit of an issue when I wanted to get some shots of this car driving around, and that was that the power would cut in and out while driving. When I wiggle around the wires connecting the battery, the car will lose power. I suspected that there was either an issue with the connector or a bad solder joint, which isn't exactly the most fun thing to have to diagnose when you're dealing with parts this small. Fortunately though, after some tugging, it became quite obvious that this positive cable going to the receiver had become disconnected. Tiny stuff here, but if you're comfortable soldering and working on parts this small, this is really about as easy as these cars get to work on, and I'm now especially glad that I built this car in the way that I did. Once again, I can gain full access to the frame, and I have both the receiver and the ESC laid out in a way that I can reach in there and solder that wire back on. Not saying it isn't a bit of a pain to do, but this is sort of the best I could hope for with this type of vehicle. It's not like I'm having to rip stuff apart to gain access to that receiver to solder that wire back on, and with that fix the car was back up and running, but there was still one more thing that I wanted to do, and that was eliminate this additional connector right here. The reason I have this adapter piece in place is because this connector here that goes to the battery was a little too large to fit into this hole in the floor that I created, and I didn't want to have to make that hole any larger as it would then become visible from the underside of the vehicle. That's why I had this adapter piece, so I could unplug the connector, which is too large to go through the hole, and then I'd be able to fully separate the frame from the body, just as I showed earlier. The problem, however, was that this connection seemed to be a little bit flaky, and the less things to go wrong with any system, the better. So I eliminated this connector entirely by just soldering this large connector directly to everything else. And then I just modified the connector in a way that the battery can still be connected, but it'll fit through that hole when I need to remove the chassis in the future. The car is now back up and running perfectly. Not very fast, but nice and smooth and functions just as it should. As with any highly detailed model, fantastic scale looks is obviously a given, but when you can actually drive the vehicle around and incorporate these components in a way that keeps them as out of sight as possible, it really takes the project to another level. Again, mixing artistry and engineering. A good challenge, but a lot of fun too. I think some takeaways from this video for any aspiring RC model builders out there would be to try and think about serviceability when building your vehicle. The accessibility here of both the entire chassis and the electronics is about as good as I could have hoped for with a plastic model to RC conversion like this. The tiny size of these electronics allow them to be hidden just about anywhere on the vehicle, but in the event they ever need to be accessed for resoldering or replacement, as was the case here, the less things that need to be ripped apart to gain access, the better. That's why securing things together with hardware rather than glue is generally better, but sometimes that's easier said than done. Another takeaway is, just as I mentioned at the end of building this vehicle, I would highly recommend either this particular model kit that I used or one of the numerous reissues that have been released of this kit over the past few decades. This is just one of those models that I think is really well suited for an RC conversion with how everything is designed and goes together. It can easily be modified in the way that I've done here, with it including one of our FC01 front suspension assemblies and an MA10 rear axle. Now, to say everything just fell into place would be a bit of an oversimplification, but it really did turn out nice and was about as easy to build as I could have hoped for. The kit may be lacking some detail in a few areas, especially by modern plastic model kit standards, but I still think it builds up into a really nice looking vehicle. Though keep in mind, if you want to add some functional lights like I've done here, it will take a bit of extra work due to the design of this vehicle having the lights more externally mounted from the body rather than being integrated like on this car here. Because the lights are not integrated into the body like a vehicle from a decade or two later would tend to be, you have to run the wires in a way that keeps them as out of sight as possible. This can make things more challenging, but you're not learning anything new if you're not taking on these challenges. And I guess one final takeaway would be to really get good at soldering these tiny connections. I'm not exactly the best at this, so that could definitely make getting everything wired a bit more stressful, but I have gotten better with practice, as with anything else. In addition to making sure those solder joints are nice and strong, incorporating some sort of strain relief so you're not putting any pressure on those joints or wiggling them around while you're messing with the wires would probably be a good idea. I've done that with some other projects, but doing something like that from the beginning on the Chevy might have saved me from having to deal with that intermittent power issue that I encountered earlier. But there you go, the 39 Chevy is back up and running and both looking and driving great. If you're interested in doing a similar project, definitely check out the aforementioned build series here on YouTube, as well as some additional information, tutorials, and 3D print files that we have available over on our Patreon. Links for both will be below in the description. As always, a huge thanks to all of our Patreon supporters and channel members for helping to make these videos possible. I hope you all enjoyed this little update and look at this 39 Chevy Coupe, and it might in some way be helpful to any of you RC model car builders out there. If you want to look at a maintenance adventure that wasn't quite so simple and straightforward, check out this prior video featuring a 1977 GMC General where replacing the steering servo turned out to be a little bit more of a hassle. But as with anything, some lessons were learned and improvements have been made with future projects. But that's all I've got for today's video. As always, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.